So I don't want to leave the impression that because I'm asking all these hard questions that I don't support sheltering of people. Of course, I very much do. And I also want to make sure that whatever efforts we take are successful to the folks that need the shelter and to our city writ large.
That's Seattle City Council member Maritza Rivera speaking out this week with a number of questions about Mayor Wilson's plans to add 500 new homeless shelter spaces in time for the World Cup in June. That plan has turned into some fast-track legislation this week. So what's this plan all about? How much will it cost? Plenty of questions to consider. Plus, does Seattle need an audit of its Human Services Department too? After this evidence of fraud and mismanagement of funds has rocked King County, some new details emerging this week. And hopefully you haven't been holding it too long, but Seattle might finally get some public restrooms back online here after many failed attempts in the past. Early warning, folks, plenty of terrible bathroom humor ahead, along with these stories and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I am a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine, and I am with my friend and co-host, David Croman, the City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. David, I got to ask, you took a ride on the new light rail across Lake Washington this weekend. Did you make it back in one piece? It looks like you're okay. What happened?
I wish I could say that I had. I was actually the kind of traffic cop for Nick Deshaies and Mike Lindblom's experience on the light rail. So I got to be sitting at my desk behind a computer while they had all the fun riding the actual light rail.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, at least
So I haven't taken the trip yet. I'm excited to do that for the first time.
It will happen. I'm glad you're tracking traffic too. That's always important. Thank you, David. Thanks also to our patrons. If you're not a patron, please do become one and support the show. You get Patrons First podcasts. I'm working on that, folks. We're going to have one of those coming soon. Plus, a cool decal for you too. Seattle News, Views, and Brews coming your way with that. So make sure you check it out. Find Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon and make sure you support the show. A big thanks also for watching this podcast on Converge Media. The video version of the show is on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, let's get things rolling. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Well, first up this week, a follow-up on a story we've been tracking the past few weeks here. The mayor's plan to stand up 1,000 homeless shelter units in her first term. 500 by June is her stated goal. So this week, the council and the rest of us are actually seeing some legislation, 3 bills that set out to do as follows. First, increase the number of people allowed in tiny home villages or RV lots or tent cities. We've touched on that on the show earlier. 2, for new sites for tiny homes or encampments. The mayor wants to let finance and administrative services take care of that without council approval for sites up to 65,000 square feet. Currently, the limit is 18,000 feet before FAS has to get council approval. And then third, the mayor has found $17.5 million in funding for these 500 new shelter units, enough for partial year operations and startup costs. David, I wanted to lay that all out here because there's a ton to pick apart. City staff certainly had some questions about this. What are you seeing in the mayor's plan?
Yeah, I think one thing that stood out is the central staff, the council central staff's reaction that basically they don't think it's possible to get 500 new shelter units online by the World Cup by June, basically. And this is a group of people who are not politically leaning or anything like that. Their job is to pass down sober policy analysis. I think their basic point is, you're talking about getting land and, management, employees, and actually people moved in there by June. Their answer was basically that's a big, heavy lift. I think the other piece that's going to be difficult for the mayor's office is they are essentially asking the council to do some early budgeting to make a change to the city's budget before it's actually budget season. And, every year we see some piece of legislation come through that essentially tries to jump the budget conversation in the following fall and get money for a priority before they actually get into the full budget budget discussion. And, the thought on that is, once you actually get into budget, it becomes really competitive and difficult to get those dollars. The council, though, I think is going to be really reticent to make any kind of big budget decisions before the actual fall budget deliberations. And then, and we heard from the council just sort of some broad concerns around neighborhood engagement and throughput. And so, it's a lofty goal. And I think the first council meeting is its first introduction to the gravity of City Hall, that big lofty goals from the mayor's office can get kind of pulled back down to earth by council people, and
Yeah.
that is part of the process, and it also is perhaps part of the reason why some of these things take longer than you might expect.
Right, right. I was struck too by that report from the council staff there, just saying, it's not clear at all that passage of this would result in 500 new units of shelter, things of that nature. And then there was also a concern about ongoing costs of these units to keep them running. Now, I think this is that budget piece you're touching on here, David, but could you speak to this? Because Councilmember Rivera was certainly talking about this. Okay, great. We get these shelter units online. What about costs going into the future? What does that look like? I don't know. Is there enough? I don't. What's the best way to put this? What is the way that the mayor's office could answer some of those concerns about costs that might be ongoing for adding these units?
Well, they think that they have identified something around $5.5 million for initial startup costs, but the estimates we saw were that it'd probably be something around $17 million a
Yeah.
year, which is a lot. Perhaps not in the whole city budget, but when you're talking about negotiations around the general fund,
Mm-hmm.
$17 million, a lot of times it's kind of council people fighting tooth and nail for two, three, four, five, $6 million. Setting aside $17 million out of an already thin general fund budget, that's going to be a bit of a fight. I think again, the council, or I mean, the mayor's office, I think is just kind of they're putting their chips on the table here, saying, you know what, this is what we ran on. We were aggressive in our goals. We think that the voter, Mayor Wilson was elected,
Yeah.
and we think you should, uh, you know, make good on what the voters heard and
Mm-hmm.
agreed to.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's going to be that easy, I don't know. I would be doubtful.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to watch this unfold over the next couple of weeks because some big votes are expected, not only in the weeks upcoming, but then when the full council actually has to take a look at this. I think that's going to be a true test there. So thank you for bringing that up, David. Definitely something we're going to keep an eye on here, folks. I should point out the council has a ton of other issues on its plate this week, things we've talked about on the podcast over the past months. There are some amendments to the library levy. Public hearing on that happening Thursday at 5:30 in the evening. You got some votes from the full council to protect surveillance data and new requirements for immigration inquiries by police. The Stadium District repeal is moving through committee. There's even an NBA readiness roundtable. We're keeping track of all these issues. But David, I wanted to focus on a piece you wrote in the Times last week about developers calling for the rollback of mandatory housing affordability requirements. We've touched on this issue before too, but now it sounds like there may be some movement on the city government side to actually make some changes to this program. What's going on?
Yeah, the argument here from a pretty well organized group of developers is, when we first passed the mandatory housing affordability program in stages over 20 from 2017 to 2019, that was sort of a generationally good environment for investment. Um, and this might get a little in the weeds here, but people kind of think of development or how developers view projects as like there's this profit margin and that can
Mm,
kind of go up or down. But the
yeah.
argument that some of these developers were making is it's not really about that. It's about there's a certain level that if you dip below that level, then outside investors from places beyond Seattle are no longer going to be interested in buying into that. So it's less about whether the developers are making 6% or 6.5% on their
Mm-hmm.
projects. It's that if you go below 6%, then you just don't get any investment at
Ah,
all.
okay.
They're saying that by pausing this program that requires developers to pay into an affordable housing pot or put affordable units on site, by pausing that, you basically make it so that math equation where investors want to actually spend money on development in
Mm-hmm.
Seattle becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah.
They're not saying that is the entire reason why development in Seattle is difficult right now, because it really is. If you look at the number of permits being filed right now, it's falling off a cliff. It's just a fraction of what it was just a few years ago.
Yeah.
But they're saying, of all of the things that the city can do, this is the one piece that it has the most control over, which is this fee that is associated with building affordable housing. Uh, we can dial it down while
Yeah.
development is slow, and then if it starts coming back, we can dial it back up. And of all of the things that the city has talked about doing, the argument here is that this is the most accessible and will have the most immediate impact if the city can dial this back.
Right. And we're hearing from a number of different voices in terms of the development community out there, including the Housing Development Consortium, which is all about affordable housing. And they're looking for some changes here, too. I'm stealing some of your notes here, David, from your article, but last year, roughly half as many permit applications as 2024, less than 18% of what the city was doing in 2020. So basically, this MHA program, it's not bringing in as much money. It used to bring in $74 million in 2021, for example, just $31 million last year. And I did want to go a little bit further on that idea that with this potential pause out there, I think the concern from some people would be, oh no, we don't want to make that permanent. This should
Right.
just be a pause. Can you take me down that path? Because I think that's an important part to this too.
Yeah, it's because I think it's easy. It was such a heavy lift to get this thing passed in the first place, and there are a lot of developers out there and developer-minded people who say it was flawed from the start. It never should have existed.
This grand bargain that
This
the city
grand
struck.
bargain.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so if this proposal or whatever to pause the housing, the fee that is levied on developers is written in a way where you have to proactively put it back into place, that
Mm-hmm.
I think could be really difficult because there are a lot of people that would be perfectly happy with it going away. And so that's why
Mm-hmm.
the proposal so far we've heard is, you put a 3-year hiatus on it, write it in a way that it guarantees it comes back. Again, there is like genuine debate around whether or not this policy was ever good or whether it should come back, but I just don't think there is quite the appetite in City Hall to see it totally disappear. And so, whatever ends up coming through council, I would expect it would be pretty narrowly defined and very specific so that it's guaranteed to return at some point.
Yeah, and we're talking about the land use chair here on the council, Councilmember Eddie Lynn. You talked to him. It sounded like he was receptive to this idea. What's the best way to describe that?
Yeah, he is receptive to the idea, and he thinks
Okay.
that the city hall needs to do something to spur private development. And I think his voice here is important because he is seen as, kind of a progressive council person. Um, the housing affordability program, I think, was cheered by particularly a lot of progressives, and so the fact
Mm-hmm.
that he is kind of interested here and is saying, part of our solution has to be supply side, has to be from the
Yeah.
market, from private developers, and we need to do something to get them to build more housing,
Mm-hmm.
and that could include rolling back this fee. I think that shows that there is real traction here in City Hall, and it sounds like there have been conversations with the mayor's office that have progressed. Um, you know, Again, though, I think there is still a bit of this feeling, perhaps less so than in 2015, but there's still a bit of this feeling that developers are a resource to be tapped,
Mm.
and therefore I think the notion among I think a still fairly broad swath of the voting public that the city
Mm-hmm.
would go easy on developers may not necessarily be that politically popular, which is
Mm.
why I think it's being framed as a temporary pause.
Yeah.
It's also not going to be a full rollback. So the idea is if you can roll it back 75 to 90% and that spurs new development, then you are maybe bringing in some more money even than you would otherwise,
Yeah.
because if there is no development, then there's no money for affordable housing.
Fair, fair. I know that's a story we're going to be tracking too. Thank you for that, David. All right, well, up next, at least one Seattle leader is now calling for audits at the city level after mounting evidence of financial mismanagement from King County's Department of Community and Human Services. That story next on Now Hear This. Well, this week, Seattle city leaders are taking notice, with King County council members calling for a new Office of Inspector General to oversee a fraud investigation into the county's Department of Community and Human Services. DCHS took in billions of dollars in grants, as reported in the Seattle Times, but dismissed warnings and red flags suggesting contractors were misusing tax dollars. This is an issue that has been on King County's radar for a while, since an audit of DCHS last year, which the Times also covered. That's when I was speaking with then King County executive candidate Gurmai Zahalai.
The results of that audit were unacceptable. As elected officials, we have a paramount duty of protecting taxpayer dollars, and this is an instance where I believe that the department lowered barriers for maybe smaller organizations to be able to participate, to get resources, and assumed more risk. And I believe that balance was not appropriate in this situation.
First, a tip of the cap to Lulu Ramadan and David Gutman for their work on this story. And I wanted to cover this, David, because this week, Seattle City Council member Maritza Rivera wants to audit the city's Human Services Department, too, because that department worked with some of the same contractors as the county. What's your take on that? Do you have a sense for how deep this fraud might go? I just wanted to throw it out there.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, part of the problem with the King County system is there's very poor, it appears, very poor oversight, and so there are indications of a lot of uh, improper payments and improper use of this money. But because
Hmm.
the oversight is so thin, it's hard to know exactly how extensive that is.
Yeah.
I'll say that the Human Services Department, with King County, we're talking about around $1 billion because they've got the Best Starts for Kids
Yeah.
levy.
Yeah.
So it's a
Right.
huge pot of money that they're trying to oversee, and they clearly made a lot of mistakes in the systems they put in place to
Hmm.
oversee that. The Human Services Department isn't that big. It's got a $400 million budget. A lot of that money goes to the King County Regional
I see.
Homelessness
At the
Authority
city level, you're talking here.
at
Okay.
the
Yeah.
city level. So when
Yeah.
we're talking about Councilmember Rivera's comments about
Yeah.
auditing human
Hmm.
services contracts, the we're not talking at nearly the same size as the
Got it.
county.
Got it.
And then, if you kind of look through who the city partners with on a lot of those contracts, particularly some of the big ones, it's organizations that, you could probably have debates around their effectiveness
Mm.
exactly, but
Yeah.
well-respected organizations, and there's not any indication that they're committing outright fraud. But that's not to say that there aren't some contracts, because human services does a lot of things. Of course, there's the big top line homelessness
Hmm.
services, but then there are things like food, food for fresh farm food
Yeah.
for
Yeah. Yeah.
people who might not have access to it, and
Hmm.
those kind of contracts. I think, sure, yeah, it's good to take a look at those and see what you have.
Hmm.
It'll be a question to see what the city auditor can and will do. It's a small office. They only do 6 or 7 audits a year.
Right.
So I think we'll see if they end up taking this up.
Okay.
But I think it's also an acknowledgement that it's just a really bad look for King County, and the city doesn't want to be caught in that same situation.
Yeah, and I wanted to go down that path a little bit further here with you, David. And let me know if I'm taking this too far, but I'm trying to think about the impact of this story on this larger effort to just provide human services in Seattle and King County, shelter with services. It's a huge part of what Mayor Wilson's trying to do to help people who are homeless, for example. Is there a larger impact to the story when you think about the importance of human services and what people think about them generally?
Yeah, I think it probably instills a level of skepticism. Again, a lot of the kind of main things around homelessness that the city had been trying to do for years now goes to the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. So that, a lot of those kind of big picture stuff is now outsourced essentially to this other entity. But,
Yeah,
when you hear about Katie Wilson pushing for 4,000
right.
units of shelter with on-site services, I think it certainly doesn't instill a lot of trust,
Mm,
you know, which is too bad because that is really difficult work. And you'll hear this sometimes, is there is this sort of there's this sort of feeling that there are some certain organizations out there, and I won't name any names,
hmm.
that like to take on quote easier cases where
Ah,
they're
okay.
to make their results look a little better, whereas other
Sure.
organizations might take on harder cases and therefore the results don't look as good, but you need some kind of organization to take on those harder situations. And so if you get into the situation where people don't trust that the work is actually
Mm,
being done, it gets,
right.
I think, even more difficult to have outside providers kind of step up and take on some of the most difficult work if they're going to be then accused or suspected of fraud. So
Yeah.
certainly kind of poisons the well a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, or at the very least scrutinized very deeply over this kind of work. That's certainly ahead here for all these human services providers in Seattle and King County. I can certainly see that. I did want to touch on another big story here with you, David. The city attorney's office, this is kind of developing right now. New city attorney Erica Evans wants to appeal the verdict from this past January that found the city was negligent in the fatal shooting of Antonio Mays Jr. at the CHOP, Capitol Hill organized protest in 2020. So a King County jury awarded Mays' father and his estate $30.5 million. City Attorney Evans says there was a 90% chance or more that Mays was going to die from his wounds, regardless of a delay in medical care. and David, this is coming from some of your colleagues at the Times, of course. I wanted to touch on this, though. What do you make of this request from City Attorney Evans? This was such a hot button issue for the city here dealing with CHOP. What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, there's kind of a legal and fiduciary
Mm,
responsibility. It's it almost in some ways doesn't matter exactly what City Attorney Erica Evans believes. Her client is the city of
mm,
Seattle,
okay.
and basically the law firm representing the city of Seattle, it's that office's duty to try and win get the best outcome for its client. And so they, in this case, feel like the judge overlooked some things or didn't give great instructions to the jury about what it was that they were actually deciding on. And $30 million dollars it's not the biggest settlement in the city's history, but it's up there,
Hmm.
certainly. Um, and so, if the attorney believes that they didn't get the best result for their client for whatever reason, it is kind
Yeah,
of their obligation as the lawyer to pursue every avenue to try and get that result. Um,
right.
and it shouldn't, you kind of get into a dangerous situation if you um, think too heavily about whatever kind of Erica Evans' personal views
Sure.
might end up
Right,
being
right,
here,
right, right.
because again, it's her and her office's obligation to represent the city of Seattle, and those lawyers think they have a case here.
Yeah, and getting it, I am not an attorney and you aren't either, but getting a retrial on something like this is difficult. It doesn't
Yeah.
happen that often. And I guess
It's
one
more
of the,
likely probably to go to an appeal rather
yeah,
than a retrial in that same courtroom.
right, right, right. Good point. I guess the other big challenge I was seeing with this is the case has not been solved in terms of who killed Antonio Mays Jr. We don't know that. And here we are 6 years later looking at this. And the city, as I understand it, is kind of arguing that the jury should have been instructed to kind of split the blame between the
Hmm.
city and the person who actually shot Antonio Mays Jr., who hasn't been found. Kind of hard for me to wrap my head around that. What do you think about that piece of it?
Yeah, also hard for me to wrap my head around. It's very surgical and mathematical in kind of a strange way that you wouldn't expect for a situation when someone's shot and killed, that you break it down by percentage of
Yeah, right, right.
fault and odds of somebody actually being killed. So,
Yeah.
but I guess that's how these settlement deliberations go.
You got to do that. And I guess just a last touch on this, David. I feel like this speaks to maybe at least some part of this, just a larger concern about funding for the city and how much money is going out the door. I think that's part of the, I guess, calculation here too, wouldn't you think?
That is part of the calculation. The city has insurance for things like this. I don't
Right.
know the extent of the coverage.
Yeah.
Again, I remember, I think it was, God, it was probably 2017, something like that. I covered a case of a young woman who was a lawyer at a high profile law firm who was then hit by an ambulance and basically couldn't work again for the rest of her life. And the
Okay.
jury decided, I think that settlement was like $60 million dollars because
Okay.
they were taking into an account what she could have lost, could have made, her earning
Mm.
potential, so to speak. That didn't bankrupt the city. I mean, it probably sent insurance rates a little higher, but they have funds for these things, and but again, it isn't necessarily about what they can spend or absorb. It's about what they think is or should be the best result for their client here.
Yep. Yep. No, that's an important way to look at it. Thank you for framing it up that way, David. All right. Well, coming up, we're fleshing out or maybe flushing out a story on high-tech public bathrooms coming back to Seattle. Yep. We are going there, kind of, sort of. That story just ahead on What's Next. Well, David, I saw this story in Publicola about the city of Seattle trying to set up some high-tech public restrooms in the very near future. Looks like they want to set these up in the Pioneer Square neighborhood. I remember covering this back in 2008. The city spent $5 million on installation, cleaning, and maintenance for these new high-tech bathrooms. They had to tear them down. Basically, five of these things that were installed just 4 years earlier. They were downtown on Broadway and Capitol Hill. I just wanted your take on, is the 2026 version going to work? Because it looks like the vendor is trying to set it up so it's accessible with an app or a QR code, or if you don't have a phone, there's an entry card you might be able to get there. What do you think about this? Is this new plan going to work?
It's a good question. The toilets just feels like one of those very frustrating things that should be simple and yet for whatever reason has not been.
Never are.
Uh,
Never are.
that said, I will say the ones, as far as I can tell, the one on the waterfront, the public restroom there seems to be pretty well run and well maintained. Uh, I think that has a full-time staff person, so I'm not sure you would want that at every public restroom. Um, in short, I don't know the answer to your question.
Yeah.
I do think it was one of those campaign pledges from Mayor
Right.
Katie Wilson that I think was appealing to people, and actually the subject of my favorite campaign poster of hers that she put up around
Oh, Big
the
Dumper.
baseball stadium.
Yes.
It said,
Yes.
"What was it? The city of Big Dumper deserves public restrooms," and I thought
Good
that was pretty
gracious.
clever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but again, that's one of those like good, can progressives and Democrats perform basic city functions? It feels like
Yeah.
uh, providing public restrooms should be one of those things that it's not particularly sexy or ideological or anything like that. It's just, can city government do something as simple as build a bathroom and have it work? Is
Yeah.
in some ways a big, I know we're talking about bathrooms, but is in some ways a big test for the functionality of City Hall.
Kind of, sort of. And I think I was interested in reading this piece about it and some of the different people that are working on it, who include folks from the Seattle Department of Transportation there. And I think the important designation here is, if this is just seen as a service for the homeless, people who are homeless, I should say, I think that almost defeats it, because if it isn't we're answering a need, because, hey, I'm around Pioneer Square, I could use to go to the bathroom. I don't happen to be homeless, but if it doesn't turn into something that answers a larger need, then I don't know if a project like this is successful. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I do. And I think that is where, I said it wasn't a particularly ideological question. In some ways it is, though, because it
Mm,
does get to this piece of, it taps into these issues around homelessness and public space and who's entitled to what and who deserves what. And so I don't know if it needs to justify itself to that level. I agree, I'm just walking around. It's like, I guess I can go in and spend $3 on a cup of coffee, and
yeah,
maybe somebody who's homeless can't. And
yeah.
so to that point, it probably does need some kind of higher purpose to justify itself. But if you can get the cost down from 5 million to something more reasonable, then
Right.
I don't know that there's a lot of people who would oppose having a few extra toilets around the city.
Yeah, it looks like they're not exactly the size of a trailer. They are a little bigger than a porta pot from what I've seen. So it's interesting. And interesting too that Pioneer Square is saying, "Yep, come on down," because that is one neighborhood that is very rigid about the different, historical
Right.
settings and whatever else. Was that interesting to you that they actually said Pioneer Square was saying, "Come on down with this"?
Yeah, it is interesting to me. There's also a pretty large homeless
Yeah,
population that lives
right,
down
right,
there. So,
right.
and people will use the bathroom one way or the other. And
Yeah,
so I think there's
right,
probably
right.
some motivation to have that not be in alleyways and things like that.
Yeah, yeah, fair enough. And I am going to check in with you later where you're getting a $3 cup of coffee, man.
Yeah.
That's kind of tough to find. I'm throwing that out. Not as
Wait, I
but
bought one today. Oh, but it was in Kitsap. It was in Kingston. There were the 12-ounce drip that I bought was 250.
Okay. All right. Well, now that's where I'm headed next. I mean,
Yeah.
it's probably worth the trip. We do need to wrap up, David. I wanted to make sure I got your impressions of the first week of Mariner baseball. My probably not all that hot take is, if they can keep a winning record with their 2 through 4 hitters basically not doing squat, I'd say they're in pretty good shape. What do you got?
Yeah, it's like, yeah, if the people who are supposed to hit, then this is a really good team because the pitching looked great, and
Yeah.
all the all the hitters that are in the other parts of the lineup other than 2 through 4 look really good. You have to assume that, Cal Raleigh, people forget Cal Raleigh had a really bad start to last year too, and
Hmm.
we all know how that ended up. So,
Yeah,
you
and
know,
Polanco totally carried the team. People
that's
forget
right.
that too, but it's
Now
yeah,
it's
and
Cole Young and
yeah,
Brendan Donovan.
those guys. Yeah, I was this Donovan guy. Last touch on him, the leadoff guy for the Mariners. He's pretty exciting to watch.
Yeah, he's the kind of player. I mean, it's great to see them trade for a guy and then him immediately start producing. It feels like Mariners fans are used to trading for a guy and then seeing him kind of tank at least for the first few months of the year. So
Hmm.
he's looking pretty good.
I love it. Jeff Cirillo has entered the chat. Watch out.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a lot going on
Colton
there.
Wong and Sean
Sure.
Figgins, and the
The
list
list
goes
goes
on.
on. The curse of third base, indeed. David, thank you as always. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron, please, by checking out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thank you for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, and across the world. The Netherlands making a strong showing last week. Bedankt. Thank you. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.